Good afternoon. My name is Steve Leach and I am the Head of Business Development for the North East Business Resilience Centre, or NEBRC for short. We are a not-for-profit organisation that's set up between police, businesses and academia, and our purpose is to make cybersecurity more available, understandable and affordable for other businesses. I'd like to welcome you to the latest in a series of webinars. Today's is being presented by Chris Murray from Bleam and is around Cyber Essentials. Chris and Bleam are going to walk you through what's involved in gaining Cyber Essentials, explain why it's an important certification, and inform you of how to start the process of gaining it. If you've got any questions, then please use the chat or drop us an email. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Chris from Bleam. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Murray. I'm from Bleam Cybersecurity, and I'm just going to slowly get my slideshow up, if you give me 1 second. Yeah, I'm Chris from Bleam Cybersecurity. We are a certification body for the Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus scheme. We can help businesses with various different security requirements, so things such as ISO 27001, NIST or Cyber Essentials. We also offer managed security services and incident response too. So as Steve just said, we're going to talk about Cyber Essentials in a bit more detail today and talk around what the scheme is, where it came from, and also look at some of the controls and how you can implement them. And talk about some of the different ways and some of the key areas to look at when you're going through the Cyber Essentials assessment. So for those of you that don't know what Cyber Essentials is, Cyber Essentials is a government-backed cybersecurity certification scheme, and it helps to protect organisations of all sizes from commodity cyber attacks. And there's two parts of Cyber Essentials. There's Cyber Essentials, which is effectively an online questionnaire. So you self-attest and answer those questions, and then a certification body, such as ourselves, would then mark your assessment and either issue the certificate or send it back to you to ask for more information. Once you've done that self-assessment, providing you pass it, you can then also go on to do Cyber Essentials Plus, which is actually, it's based on the same standard. It's just a more technical assessment. It adds more assurance to the assessment. So we do some extra checks there, such as scanning your external networks and scanning your client devices and doing further checks to make sure that you are doing what you've said you're doing on this self-assessment questionnaire. Now, I think it's important to position Cyber Essentials and cybersecurity in a way that everybody understands it. One of the things that I often get asked is, what's the difference between information governance or things like ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials? Now, the answer is that Cyber Essentials is a specific cybersecurity standard, whereas ISO 27001 looks at information governance. It looks at the overall picture of security risks. So you would look at, okay, what risks do we have as a company, and then decide which information security or cybersecurity controls you need to put in place to mitigate those risks. So really, Cyber Essentials slots in quite nicely to ISO 27001. So ISO 27001 talks about things such as technical vulnerability management and addressing technical vulnerabilities, and Cyber Essentials actually tells you how to do some of that. So for instance, software updates and patch management that will help you to implement those particular ISO 27001 controls. But just going back to when government started to look into developing a scheme such as Cyber Essentials, the reason this came about was because they wanted a specific cybersecurity scheme that referenced specific cyber controls, and they reviewed what was out there, and the conclusion was that, well, the best thing really at the time was ISO 27001. However, it wasn't quite what they were looking for, which is then where Cyber Essentials came along and was developed to address that specific requirement. And over the years, the scheme itself has grown and grown and grown, and it's continued to increase its acknowledgement both in public and private sector. Many businesses will obtain Cyber Essentials, in particular Cyber Essentials Plus, because it's now a contractual requirement. Certainly if you wish to work with Ministry of Defence, for instance, they require that you as an organisation have Cyber Essentials. But it also acts as a great starting point for cybersecurity. many organisations will start to think about cyber and they won't really know what they've got to do, or they don't really have the budget to start spending money on external expertise to guide them on what tools and controls they should implement to protect their business from cybercrime. And this is why Cyber Essentials is so great, because it's an affordable and achievable scheme for businesses of all sizes, and it's certainly what the government and the ICO are expecting organisations to do more and more now. And just on that, certainly if you look at the recent breach of Cathay Pacific, they were fined £500,000 by the ICO in recent years. And on the financial penalty notice that was issued by the ICO, you can actually have a look at this as well after the presentation. They did actually quote Cyber Essentials and the fact that Cathay Pacific didn't actually adhere to Cyber Essentials. And when you think about why we implement cybersecurity into businesses, yes, it's to protect our businesses, but it's also to show that we've done our due diligence and that we can demonstrate legally defensible security, so that we're not being fined for not having adequate security, which is why Cyber Essentials is a really great place to start for small businesses. Obviously, if you're a more complex company, then you might have to do more beyond Cyber Essentials as well. So I'm going to jump in and run through the controls and the certification scheme, just covering each of the control categories and some of the main points. If you have any questions, just bob them in the Q&A throughout, and then once we've gone through everything, I can hopefully answer your questions. So I'll start with certificate scope, which is really key, because until you understand this, you can't go on and actually implement the controls, and there are some key areas here which often trip companies up. But effectively, you can choose to certify your whole organisation or a part of your organisation. Now, we would always suggest that customers strive to achieve full scope and full certification, so all devices and all services in the company would be in scope of the assessment and the Cyber Essentials controls. And what we actually look at there is essentially your client devices and server devices and networks. So Windows laptops, desktops, MacBooks, Apple computers, all those different things. And then your servers, such as Windows servers, if you have one. A lot of organizations, or certainly smaller organizations, don't have servers these days. Anything that would fall into that scope, we would add on to the assessment, including mobile phones, so Apple iPhones, Samsung Galaxy phones, any type of phone, essentially any device that either processes or stores business data or accesses a business service would be in scope of Cyber Essentials. And one particular area which often catches people out is BYOD, so bring your own device. So if you allow your employees to bring their own devices and access business services such as email, or even store emails on that device would be in scope of the scheme to the fullest extent. So all the controls that we're going to talk about would also apply to personal devices if you allow them to access your business data and services. This is the first category of controls that you will come to when you're completing the self-assessment on the Cyber Essentials portal, and you'll see this throughout the scheme and the questions that are asked. That you'll see it more frequently around passwords. So change default passwords. So if you've got a new device that you install, you need to make sure that you change the password. Often, if you buy an internet router, for instance, you'll have a default password that's on the sticker on the bottom of that device, and the scheme mandates that password is changed. But it needs to be changed to a strong password. And you also need to have a process for dealing with password compromise. So one thing that I would strongly recommend is, if you decide to go down the route of Cyber Essentials, or even if you don't and you just want to come on today to understand how you can improve your cybersecurity, it's always good to have a strong password policy, and also a policy that deals with what you would do if a password is compromised or potentially compromised. And having that policy will help deal with a number of areas when you're going through your Cyber Essentials questionnaire. The other section that's covered under firewalls and internet gateways are external network services. So what does that mean? So if you have a remote workforce, which I'm sure most companies do in the current situation, and you have a VPN configured so your remote workers can connect back into the office to access resources in the office, that is an external network service. Or you may have a web application running, and that is also an external network service. And what Cyber Essentials asks is that every single external network service which you have should have a business justification. One of the things that we often find when assessing client networks when we do Cyber Essentials Plus is that they often have services that are externally available, which they don't really have a business justification for. And the reason that you should have a business justification for each service is because the more you have exposed externally, the more risk that places onto your business. So if you don't need external network services, then turn them all off. The other thing that this section looks at is around firewall configuration and how that's accessed. Now, what this goes into really is, can you access the configuration of your firewall or router over the internet, or is it only accessible on the local office network? I would strongly recommend anyway that your configuration is not accessible externally. Sometimes businesses, for whatever reason, decide that it needs to be externally accessible, which can significantly open them up to increased risk. It might be that your IT provider needs access to that particular router or firewall to configure it, in which case you could then actually use a VPN to mitigate some of that risk. But ideally, I would always choose to answer that question around, is your firewall or router configuration externally accessible, as no, you don't want that to be the case. The final question around firewalls and internet gateways is around software firewalls. So this is the firewall that's built into your desktop computers, so be it a Windows or an Apple device. Have you configured and enabled that firewall? So there's been a change quite recently to Cyber Essentials, whereas previously, if you had several home workers and they spent more than 50% of their time working from home, you would have to list their home router within the assessment, and the controls would also apply to that router. Now, there are good security reasons for doing that, but logistically, it can be quite difficult to do. So the NCSC and IASME have updated the scheme quite recently to basically say that if you have home workers, you can de-scope their home network and home router by enabling and configuring software firewalls, which I would strongly recommend you do that anyway, just out of best practice. So after we look at the firewalls and internet routers, we start to look at the secure configuration of your laptops, desktops, mobile devices, and so on. The first thing it talks about is, have you removed unused software? The reason for that is because the more software you have on your computers, the more risk that there's a vulnerability in some of that software, and the more risk that an attacker could exploit the vulnerability in that software and potentially, carry out a successful cyber attack, or certainly a more damaging cyber attack. So it's really important to review what software you have installed on your computers. This could be as simple as having a policy that says, every 6 months or every 3 months, we will review what software we've got installed across our devices, and we will uninstall it in add or remove programs. If you want to be a bit more advanced and you manage what software is installed on your devices centrally or through an app store, you could also do it that way. Similar story for unnecessary user accounts. So when you buy a device, or if you get a device with a default configuration on it, it often comes with standard out-of-the-box user accounts. You need to make sure that they're removed, because they could have default passwords on them, and it could potentially act as another attack vector for someone to escalate the privileges or carry out a cyber attack within your organization. And as I mentioned previously, again under here, all of your client devices and servers and so on should be subject to using, changing the default passwords and using a really strong password with good quality, so it can't be easily breached. This also looks at secure external services again. So this is specifically talking about services that are accessible externally. So again, VPNs or web applications. that could potentially give someone access to data that you would otherwise not want to be public. And there are very specific questions around this in how you actually secure that data. So, for instance, if you've got a web application and behind that there is some sensitive data, it asks questions around, well, you know, have you got, a strong password policy in place for this application? How do you deal with compromised passwords? And how do you actually limit login attempts if someone's trying to, you know, log into the application multiple times with the incorrect password? The final piece on secure configuration is around disabling auto run and autoplay, and that's just a setting on your Windows or Apple devices that will prevent, so if you plug in a USB stick or a CD, it will prevent that application from running automatically if there's one on there. Sometimes USB drives are a delivery mechanism for malware, and the same as CD drives. So it's really just a bit of an insurance policy to make sure it doesn't execute something malicious when you plug it into your computer. And moving on to security update management. So I think previously this was called patch management, but this has also been changed quite recently. And it really what it's asking to do is quite simple. It's asking that you remove unsupported operating systems from your environment. So, for instance, if you're using Windows XP, then you know that's not acceptable. That's not going to pass, and you need to upgrade to something that's in support and receiving security updates. Just a note on that though, Windows 10 operating systems, for instance, not all of the versions of Windows 10 are supported. So there's some old feature versions that no longer receive security updates. So it's just about making sure that you're installing the latest updates. And the same goes for applications. And the same stands as what I said before around removing unused software applications, in that you need to install these security updates to ensure, and remove unsupported applications to ensure that there are lesser security vulnerabilities, which means that there are less vulnerabilities for someone to exploit and potentially carry out a cyber attack against your business. And also make sure all your software is licensed accordingly. One thing that we often see around Java, so Java actually changed some of its support mechanisms. So if you want to receive security updates for Java now, you actually need a commercial license with Java. But overall, the control is asking that you install high risk and critical security updates within 14 days of release. This can be quite tricky though, for various reasons. Firstly, a lot of vendors don't actually publish what severity their security updates are now. They just say it's a security update. So generally best practice would say just make sure that you're installing updates. How you install updates, you know, there are two ways really in which you can address this. You could do it with a policy and say, you know, you'll configure automatic updates, and that people will check for updates every 14 days, albeit in practice that probably doesn't work as well as it should in most cases. If you really want to be on top of this, you could consider a third-party patch management solution, which would update both third-party applications and operating systems. Now, just jumping back up to unsupported operating systems and unsupported applications. Obviously, in some scenarios, you know, a company may be running unsupported operating systems, and for various reasons, they can't update those operating systems. That's not to say that you can't achieve cyber essentials. It just means that you'd have to change the scope, and potentially you would end up segregating those systems on a separate network away from the scope of your cyber essentials compliant network. But where possible, you really need to be updating and removing those operating systems, because if they're no longer receiving security updates, it's a really significant risk for your business. If you know, if something malicious was to get on the inside of your network, or you know, for instance, through a phishing email, it could potentially act as an attack vector and a way for them to gain full access across your whole network of computers. And moving on to user accounts. So this looks at, okay, you know, do you have a creation process for user accounts with approvals from senior management that will approve the creation of new accounts? So again, a policy or a procedure here is a good way of addressing this. Everybody needs to have individual logins. That includes external suppliers too. So if you have a managed service provider that supports your company, you'd also want them to have a an individual login, not just a single admin account. And the reason for that is down to traceability and auditing. You know, if there's a problem or something happens and it happens on a shared user account, it's often much harder to understand what has actually happened. When if you've got individual logins, it's easier to piece the story together. You also need a leavers process to make sure that you're disabling or deleting accounts as people leave. That's very important. Again, just down to legacy accounts on systems, and if they use a weak password or a breached password, it may act as an attack vector and a way forward if you're breached. And finally, all accounts should be assigned access with role-based access control and least privileged in mind. So essentially, when you give a user an account in your company, you want them to have the access that they require to do their role and nothing more than that. You don't want to give them access for the sake of giving access, because that will again introduce extra risk into the company. Following on from user accounts, there's also a separate section on administrator accounts, and again this requires a process with approvals for administrator accounts, and you need to ensure that accounts are only used for administrative purposes. So what does that mean? Don't use an admin account for browsing the web or reading emails. And everybody should have separate admin accounts. So you would have a standard user account, which you browse the web and read emails, and you'd have an admin account, which you would only use for those administrative purposes. And that might be, updating something or changing some configuration or removing some software, but they should always be separate. The reason for that is because if you, for instance, received a phishing email and you were logged in as an admin, and you open that phishing email and there's some malicious software there, because you're an admin, that malicious software has immediately got an increased level of access to your network, which could potentially lead to a greater level of compromise and a much bigger breach. You also need a list of administrative users, and you need to regularly review that list. However, I would suggest regularly reviewing all of your accesses anyway, not just admin access, and just to make sure that everybody has the right access levels assigned to them and so on, and that no one's got that extra access that they no longer need because potentially they've moved role. And the other thing it talks about is enabling two-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication across your administrative accounts. But again, I would strongly recommend you enable that across all accounts, be them admin or user accounts, just for peace of mind, just to increase your security there. But last section, malware protection. So this is the final category, and this talks about all of your client devices, so be it desktops, mobile phones and servers. You need to protect them from malware, and there's 3 ways of doing that. Firstly, certainly for desktops and computers, the most common way is anti-malware software, so antivirus. You need to be running an up-to-date version of that antivirus software. It needs to have updates sent to it at least daily, and it needs to be configured to scan web pages. The mobile devices, generally you would select application signing. You wouldn't select the anti-malware software. So for instance, Apple and Android devices, they use application signing, so you can only install software from the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store unless the phone is jailbroken, which that would be a failure. But effectively that acts as a mechanism, because Apple and Google do some due diligence on the apps that are listed on those repositories of software. So you can be fairly assured that if you install software, it's not got malware in it, although that's not to say that doesn't happen, because it does, which is also why, as part of the Cyber Essentials scheme, you should have a list of approved applications in the Apple apps, from the Apple App Store, from the Play Store, from the Microsoft Store, whichever stores you use, that you dictate can be installed on your devices. Another way to do that, if you have a mobile device management solution or a device management solution, you could actually manage what software people can install as well. The final option is application sandboxing, albeit you're unlikely to select this. It would only really be in rare exceptions, but effectively it's putting an application or an operating system in a sandbox and disconnected environment to protect it from malware. So it's very rare that someone would select application sandboxing. But that's it at a very high level, but hopefully there was something useful in there. If you've got any questions, then please put them in the Q&A section and I'll do my best to answer them. Lizzie or Steve, is there anything in the Q&A?
There's been a couple of things, Chris, but we've been able to pick them up, I think.
Okay.
There's actually one that's just come in from Aidan Laycock. So Aidan wants to know, would we need to redo Cyber Essentials every time we hire a new staff member if they're remote working?
The answer is no. So Cyber Essentials is very much a point in time assessment. The key thing is that when you do Cyber Essentials, you list the scope for Cyber Essentials. If you want to do Cyber Essentials Plus, the scope needs to be the same. So you've got a confined window to do it. But once you've got the certificate, beyond that, you just need to make sure that you still implement and adhere to the controls of the scheme. Contractually, when you complete the Cyber Essentials assessment and achieve a certificate, you're effectively signing up and saying that, we will adhere to the scheme and continue to implement the controls, regardless of change throughout the organisation. Hopefully that answers the question. It's one thing that we can do at the end of this as well is send out some of the NCSC documentation around the scheme as well, and a copy of the or a link. I'll send a link to a copy of the self-assessment questionnaire, so you've got that information. And if you've got any questions at all, I think my email address should be on the screen. I think, yeah.
We've just had another question from Ed, Chris. Ed says, with the rise in ransomware, are you seeing a surge in demand for customers to align to these benchmarks?
Yeah, I think the main drive in people achieving Cyber Essentials is I think it's down to people wanting to do the right thing. But I think, unfortunately, the ransomware attacks do kind of push people to try and do the right thing. It's not to say that Cyber Essentials is going to stop every single ransomware attack, because that's absolutely not the case. It's all about, assessing your risk as an organisation. And if you're a small business, Cyber Essentials is a great starting point. But if you're a multinational and you're potentially quite a juicy target for a ransomware attack, then you might also need to think about doing other things as well. But I think it is pushing customers to, to consider their overall cybersecurity and information security stature and look at what's available. Cyber Essentials being one of those things. Does the certificate expire? Yes, you need to retake the assessment on a yearly basis. So every year you would retake the assessment. I've almost completed my C questionnaire. Yes, we can do an assessment by the 1st of August for Cyber Essentials. Cyber Essentials Plus, I would have to check, but I'm more. If you want to drop me an email with your details, I'm more than happy to have a chat to you about that. And someone's asked for a copy of the presentation, which I think this is. Are you going to send out the link to the YouTube after, Lizzie, or?
Yeah, we're going to send around a follow-up email after, so I can do that. That's fine.
Perfect.
I don't think we've had any more come in, so.
Oh, I think that's for now.
Oh, there's one more just come in from Aidan.
Cyber Essentials Plus, it really does vary. It's very hard to say. Some companies will bill based on the number of users in the company, but we will just ask you around what the scope is for Cyber Essentials first in order to give you a fair and accurate estimate, because you might be a 20-man business, but you might have 100 external IP addresses that need scanning. So it's really down to what size of company you are. But to give you a rough ballpark figure, probably in the middle of the road, around £2,000 roughly, with both Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. It can be less than that, but I would say that's a fair middle of the road figure.
Okay, Chris, it's Steve here. I think we're about done now. We've just gone over 2 p.m. So just a quick wrap up for me. Thank you very much for coming and doing that. Appreciate you taking your time. It's good to see that we've had some interest, and in particular, you have put yourself forward as one of our trusted partners to deliver this. So thanks a lot for that. For everybody out there, we'll do a follow-up email, make this available for you, and take any further questions either on one-to-one calls or by email. You've got Chris's on there, you'll have had ours earlier, and it'll be covered in the email. So thank you very much for attending. Hope you found it useful. Please ask some questions, and we'll catch you later.